Yeah, we're giving folks to join, maybe 1 more minute, then we'll start the seminar. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining today's seminar. I am Nargis Jareen. I'm the contract manager. So first, we'll give a short introduction on the project. Followed by that, our investigators will present on the project, and at the end, we'll handle the questions and answers. So let me share my slide. So can somebody mention if they can see my full screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jared, Barbara. Okay, so today's seminar is on the health benefit increase with more urban green space and reduce wildfire in California. Dr. Michael Jared is the PI. So we have few housekeeping tips. The slides for today's presentation and recording will be posted online after the seminar at this website. Please make sure to mute yourself if you're not speaking, but you can use the chat box to enter your questions and comments at any time. We will go over the questions after our presentation. To make verbal comments, please raise your virtual hands and I will call on to unmute in order the hands were raised. If you are calling in, you can send your question and comments to my email. We will go over the questions after the presentation. So for today's agenda, first I'll be giving a short background on the project, followed by our research team will be giving a research overview, and at the end, we'll go over questions and comments. California's landscape, or which is known as natural and working land, include forest and the green space in urban and built environment. Natural working land can provide a variety of benefits to the environment and also the well-being of Californians. These benefits include biodiversity, recreation, economic impact, and human health benefits. Natural working land are also an important component in California's fight to achieve carbon neutrality. California's 2022 scoping plan for achieving carbon neutrality has indicated that California is projected to lose carbon stock from natural working land over the coming decades. One of the drivers of this loss is wildfire, which has been increasing over the last few decades. The scale of emission from recent wildfires and the air quality impacts from wildfire smoke has caused serious and widespread harm to public health and is costing billions of dollars every year. But by conserving, restoring, and managing natural working land, we can improve the health of these lands by maximizing their ability to sequester, store atmospheric carbon, and limit the release of greenhouse gas emissions, including emission. Okay. I want to make an announcement that we are doing the presentation now. So please hold your questions until the end. We'll go over the questions and at the end, but you can certainly put your questions in the chat now. So
네, 네.
Increasing green space can also provide a positive health benefit. Okay. The objective of this study was to assess the quantitative effects of wildfires and green space on human health by doing comprehensive scoping reviews and health impact assessment, and incorporating findings to a public-facing and adaptable health scenario tool. By quantifying the health benefit of natural working land management strategies, it shows value to CARB programs for improving the public health with reduced climate change impacts. This contract supports CARB's nature-based solution programs to increase green space in California communities and also to increase forest health and also achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by reducing wildfire. Dr. Michael Jarrett is the principal investigator of this project. Dr. Jarrett is a professor and a chair of the Department of Environmental Health Science in the Fielding School of Public Health at UCLA. He's internationally recognized expert in geographic information science for exposure assessment and spatial epidemiology. For the past decades, Dr. Jarrett has researched how to characterize population exposure to air pollution and built environment variables, how to understand the social distribution of this exposure among different groups, and how to assess the health effects from environmental exposure. Over the last decades, Dr. Jarrett has also studied the contribution of the built and natural environment to physical activity, obesity, and several health outcomes. So that concludes my short introduction. You can send your question and comments to my email. So let me stop sharing my screen. Now I will hand over to Dr. Jarrett and his team for his presentation. Dr. Jarrett, you can start sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nargis, for the kind introduction, and that was very useful to set up the presentation.
Thank you.
We have a large interdisciplinary team of investigators and students, and I want to thank all of them. You can see their names on the right. It's really been, this is the culmination of what's now a 4-year project, where we did some additional work at the request of the Air Resources Board at the end of our normal 3-year project. So we've, there's a lot to share here, and we're going to try to cover a huge amount of material in a relatively short amount of time. But we welcome your questions or clarifying comments at the end. I want to also thank all of the Air Resources Board staff who've been instrumental in helping us navigate through the sometimes maze-like administrative structures that are in the state government and at UCLA, and in particular Cynthia Garcia, Barbara Weller, Bonnie Holmes-Jen, Nicole Hernandez, Nargis Jareen, and then Adam Moreno and Lee Tarney. And out of the research team, I want to give a special call out thank you to Dr. Diane Garcia Gonzalez, who really steered the process for us and served as the key project manager for the study. Now, Nargis has already given us background, so I won't belabor this too much, but suffice to say that the role of natural working lands, both as a carbon sequestration source or sink, and as a source of potential health benefits through better management, is relatively under investigated. And that's what we attempted to address as part of this study. And we wanted to quantify the human health impacts resulting from better management activities in California in 2 priority areas: wildfires and urban green space. This is just sort of a high-level summary. We did several scoping reviews of literature, and this was primarily to extract dose response functions. So those are the functions that would link, say, the health costs of wildfire smoke to the concentrations in the atmosphere. So we did that for both wildfires, urban green space, and then we also looked at different land management scenarios, such as prescribed burning, and we developed what we hope will be a public-facing decision support tool in the future. It's still in beta version now. And then we also worked on looking into the future with the scoping plan and developing exposure estimates based on improved management strategies for wildfires that were developed by Dr. Moreno and his staff at the Air Resources Board as part of the scoping plan. This just graphically shows the workflow that we had for the wildfire component, and we'll show you this for green space in a subsequent slide. So we started with this scoping review, identified these dose response functions. We then assembled health data, and this is primarily from two sources: the California Department of Public Health, which has zip code level mortality data that's publicly available. We had to do a lot of manipulations of that to get it into a form that we could do quantitative estimates with. And that's certainly one of the real strengths of this research, is that we were able to drill down below the county scale to the zip code scale so that we can quantify those health benefits, not just in aggregate, but we can show where they're likely to occur or are occurring due to, say, wildfire smoke or urban green space. And then we use the EPA's BenMaps morbidity data. And all of this was fed into a Google Earth Engine platform that allows for on-the-fly interactive queries, so you can quantify various health benefits or costs that could accrue from different management strategies. This just shows some of the literature that we identified that was instrumental to our study after reviewing literally thousands of articles. Somebody's outside giving us a serenade. I apologize for that. I can't control that. We had several sophisticated exposure models, and we start at CMAC. These were estimates that were developed by Professor Joseph Wilkins at Howard University, who was working at the EPA at the time, that give us 12-kilometer estimates, very high computational intensity, but it allows us to integrate with BenMap, do statewide coverage, and it's widely used in policymaking. Similar to that chemical transport model for the scoping into the future, we used a geochem model that had the so-called FIN inventories from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Again, very high computational intensity. Yang Li at Baylor University led this part of the study, along with Mary and Marley from our, and so we do get statewide estimates, but this was at a lower resolution of about 28 kilometers, and that was partly due to the computational intensity. And then we used what's known as a receptor-based or back trajectory Lagrangian model known as STILT, which gives us 3-kilometer estimates. And I want to show you just briefly what these estimates, what goes into them. This is a schematic that the US EPA has developed for the chemical transport models. So this would be both geochem and CMAC. And they start with a comprehensive inventory of all possible emissions. They have multi-phase chemistry, atmospheric microphysics, cloud formation and particles, and aqueous chemistry of the clouds, all integrated and built from the ground up so that we can estimate. And, importantly, these models allow us to isolate the specific impacts of, say, wildfires from other sources by turning off and on certain source tags in the algorithms. The still model is a different approach where instead of trying to model wall to wall, we take receptors and then look at all possible emission sources that could be contributing to the concentrations that are observed at that point. This is fairly computationally intensive to get the initial runs, and it's usually based on representative atmospheric conditions. And once we have it, though, it becomes a very flexible and powerful tool because we can just change or multiply coefficients based on a so-called footprint of emissions. So we can oscillate these types of emissions and then look at what it will do to concentrations at the receptor. One limitation of this type of model is it's largely dealing with primary particles. So we don't get the sophisticated secondary atmospheric chemistry that's built into the chemical transport models. So we tend to see somewhat lower concentrations with this type of model than with the CTMs. I want to present now some results from a recent study that we just published this month. Or no, I guess it was published at the end of last month. And it was in the journal Science Advances. And then my colleague, Dr. Rachel Conley, and I did an op-ed piece with the help of the Conversation, which is a science translation network, to put an editorial in the LA Times. So what we can see here are the CMAQ concentrations that were used for estimating the burden of mortality from wildfires from 2008 to 2018. Of note here is that in some years we're getting, these are purely wildfire concentrations, levels that are over 50 micrograms just from the wildfires alone. With the help of Dr. Rick Burnett of Health Canada, who I've worked with now for, 25 years or so, he's one of the leading scientists who advises the Global Burden of Disease study. He helped us to derive a mathematical algorithm for estimating potential long-term effects of wildfire smoke. And to do this, we took dose response functions from two studies, pooled them and with a Monte Carlo simulation, ratioed that to all of the short-term studies on PM 2.5 that have a dose response value. And then we multiplied that by a long-term coefficient that was from a study that my colleague Arden Pope did in 2019 based on the National Health Interview Survey, which is population representative for the United States. And the importance of this approach is that it takes into account both the acute short-term impacts of wildfires, but also the potential that the wildfires will contribute to the formation of chronic disease like atherosclerosis, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and diabetes, all of which are known to be life-shortening. So we typically see larger effects from these chronic exposures than we do from the more transient periodic exposures. And there's a long section in the paper where we justify why we think that's an appropriate approach, and that why in the past, just looking at these acute effects is probably not an effective way to characterize the health impacts. Sorry, my neighbor is playing some music now, so you're getting some blues along with this talk. This shows the basic equation that we use to estimate changes in mortality that are attributable to changes in concentrations of PM 2.5. So for this, we need that long-term dose response function. We have the changes that are occurring as a result of wildfires. And then we have the number of deaths. In this case, we did it by zip code area. So these components, the dose response function, the change in concentration, and the number of deaths that are potentially affected are critical components of the health impact assessment. And when we started this, we really didn't know what to expect in terms of the overall burden. And we were somewhat surprised at the magnitude of it. But as I mentioned, one of the strengths of this approach is that we're able to drill down and show, and this was a particularly bad year, 2018, for wildfires, where the deaths are occurring. So this can then be used as we go forward to look at what populations are being affected and what their demographic characteristics are. And we have a study that's funded by NASA that is currently looking at that. But you can see in some years, the impact is relatively smaller. And then in the bad years, it's really dramatic. And in some of these small zip codes, you're getting more than 20 deaths, on populations that range from 6,000 to maybe 60,000 in zip code areas. So a substantial number of deaths attributable to wildfire smoke. Now we add that up over the 11-year period. You can see there is an issue with the chemical transport models that they sometimes produce very high concentration levels that would not necessarily be observed if we had monitors out there. So we clipped off the top 0.1% of that. So you can see this blue bar shows the clipped levels. And you can also see the difference, like when we account for the larger dose response of wildfires, this is an undifferentiated dose response. It's based solely on the Pope study. And this is the wildfire dose response. So there's increasing evidence in the literature that wildfires appear to have a larger dose response function than undifferentiated PM. So when we add all of this up across the 11 years, we end up with more than 50,000 deaths, about 52,600. So a really large number. And then when we add up the economic cost, you can see in the bad years, it's approaching $100 billion, 80 to 100 billion. And when we add it up over the entire period, expressed in 2015 dollars, it's more than $450 billion. So these are big numbers. And we think that that's very important because it allows us to then convey to policymakers that perhaps you need to invest more in better management of the forest to avoid this type of smoke impact because the social costs are so high. So I now want to turn it over to Dr. Gonzalez for her to talk about our morbidity estimates. And I'm going to go and see if my neighbor will turn his music off so you're not hearing muddy waters as well as us.
Thank you, Dr. Jared. So I'm going to get a little bit more in detail about the literature review, where we found mixed results regarding the impacts of wildfire PM on cardiovascular health outcomes. And while there is some evidence that a biological pathway between wildfire PM exposure and cardiovascular health outcomes exist, at the time of our review, the overall evidence remained inconsistent and uncertain. We provide a detailed summary of the association and direction of relationship between wildfire PM and cardiovascular morbidity identified and extracted from the peer-reviewed literature within the report appendix. In contrast, the impact on respiratory health is clearer. We identified multiple articles that focused on respiratory outcomes and found more consistent evidence that wildfire PM significantly increases the risk of various respiratory issues. We created a crosswalk of relevant health outcomes from the identified literature and compared them to the extensive health outcome prevalence data sets available from the US EPA's BENMAPS program. Now, there is evidence that not all PM emissions are equal in their toxicity. However, the exact demarcation between wildfire and undifferentiated PM impacts is not yet fully understood. And while we acknowledge that this area of research is still growing, it was important for us to consider the potential implications for wildfire smoke, health impacts, and the unique risks posed by wildfire smoke, especially when the epidemiological literature has suggested that PM 2.5 from wildfires could potentially be more harmful than PM from other sources. And thus, from the developed crosswalk, we identified relevant and associated coefficients, prioritizing those derived from more recent Western-based studies to represent the California, our target area. Within the BenMath program, we then imported our wildfire-specific PM 2.5 coefficients identified from the previous steps, as well as the daily 12-kilometer wildland fire PM 2.5 concentrations from CMAQ, the CMAQ model, as Dr. Jarrett had shown, to estimate the health impacts within the BenMath program, and pulled the estimates where appropriate. Mike, good timing. Next slide, please. So we included undifferentiated PM, RU, PM 2.5, as shown in this on this slide, coefficients in which to draw comparisons to our estimates derived from wildfire-specific coefficients. While it was important to isolate potential risks regionally and account for local factors like fuel types and weather patterns that we see here in the Western region, we also identified a non-Western specific, or we reference as global wildfire PM 2.5 coefficient as another comparison. Now, detailed outcome estimates by year and health outcome are provided in the final report, but we have provided just a summary here of the respiratory specific health outcomes to discuss more generally. Here we present the average annual morbidity estimates from 2008 to 2018, derived using the various coefficients described here. And we estimate thousands of excess morbidity events using the Western US coefficient, which are amplified over estimates derived from both the global and undifferentiated coefficients, highlighting the need to advance the discussion on the potential health impacts of wildfire PM 2.5, and that if relying solely on undifferentiated PM estimates, we could potentially underestimate the true effects of wildfire PM 2.5, especially in regions like California, where wildfire risks are increasing along with our changing climate. And while we do not present all results here, we provide results for both respiratory and cardiovascular health outcomes within the report. And however, we do emphasize careful interpretation of the cardiovascular estimates due to the uncertainty in the peer-reviewed literature, as stated previously. Next slide, please. So now I will go ahead and pass it along to my colleague, Dr. Connolly, to discuss the urban green space.
Great, thanks so much. So this slide outlines the workflow for the urban green space aspects of the project, but Dr. Jarrett already showed a similar slide on the wildfire workflow, so I won't go into much detail on this. I will just mention that for the health burden analysis for green space, we considered potential changes in space metrics. One being normalized difference index, or NDVI, at the 0.6 meter scale from the National Agriculture Imagery Program, as well as tree canopy data from the National Land Cover Database at the 30 meter scale. Next slide, please. Next slide. I don't know if Dr. Jarrett, if you're able to do that. Thank you so much. So this slide shares a paper we published last year, quantifying the relationship between access to green space and life expectancy in LA County. And the dose response estimates from our statistical modeling in this paper are applied in our health burden analysis for green space and life expectancy that I am about to discuss. Next slide, please. So from our green space and health literature review, we identified 3 different health outcomes to quantify, which are all-cause mortality, life expectancy, and low birth weight. So we extracted dose response values from the epidemiological literature for changes in both NDVI and tree canopy, which you can see in this table. For mortality and low birth weight, these are from recently published meta-analyses. And for life expectancy, these dose response values are from our paper published last year that I shared in the previous slide. And we'll get into the green space scenarios that we incorporated on the next slide, but just to discuss, no, it's okay, you can go back. Thanks. But just to discuss the methods briefly, we estimated changes in mortality and birth weight resulting from potential increases in green space using a well-established health impact function, which was very similar to what Dr. Jarrett previously showed with respect to wildfire PM 2.5. And for mortality, we used data on deaths in each zip code throughout the state, as we did for wildfire PM, and the change in NDVI for 2 different scenarios to ultimately calculate premature mortality avoided by added greenness or through added greenness using our meta-analysis dose response value. And for low birth weight, we use data on the baseline incidence of low birth weight in each census tract across the state, along with the change in NDVI to ultimately calculate cases of low birth weight potentially avoided through added greenness, using that same meta-analysis dose response value shown on the slide. And to estimate the potential life expectancy changes or years of life saved through various green space exposures, we essentially apply these calculated dose response values for both NDVI and tree canopy with census tract population estimates in urban areas across the state to calculate the potential years of life saved for each scenario. Next slide, please. So moving into the results, so for life expectancy, we applied 4 scenarios involving varying exposures to greenness as measured by NDVI and tree canopy, as I mentioned. And so this includes the potential years of life added from a universal 10% increase in tree cover, from an increase in tree cover up to the mean value in urban areas. Also from a 0.1 unit increase in NDVI, which is on a -1 to 1 scale. And again, from an increase in NDVI to the urban areas mean. So that would only apply for regions that had baseline greenness below that mean level. And with the life expectancy scenarios applied to the entire population living in urban areas throughout California, we see substantial potential impacts of added tree canopy and NDVI on years of life saved. So for example, more than 8 million years for increasing NDVI to the urban areas mean levels. And we also, again, use census data to estimate the population life expectancy impacts for racially minoritized populations. And here we observe that in all scenarios, those populations experience the majority of the benefits, ranging from 64 to 72% of the total benefits in years of life gained. Next slide, please. So moving on to mortality and low birth weight results. So for mortality, we applied 2 scenarios, both using NDVI, and this includes the estimated deaths prevented from a 0.1 unit increase in NDVI, as well as prevented from an increase in NDVI to the mean value of greenness in urban areas. And so what we found here is a substantial impact for annual mortality for both scenarios, with more than 7,000 deaths potentially avoided or preventable from a 0.1 unit increase in NDVI, and more than 2,000 from an increase to just the urban areas mean. And the impacts on low birth weight cases are of a similar magnitude, and using dose response estimates for different estimated buffers around the residents indicate that though still statistically significant, the relationship between greenness and low birth weight is less strong for changing greenness in a larger radius around the population's residences. Next slide, please. And this is a map demonstrating the spatial distribution of health benefits for mortality on the left and life expectancy on the right for an NDVI increase to the urban areas mean. A lot of these regions in LA have low baseline greenness and large populations where potential benefits are fairly high. So next slide, please. All right, great. So now we'll introduce the health scenario tools that we developed as part of this project. And these tools evaluate the potential health benefits associated with different changes of concentrations of wildfire PM and urban green space levels. And there are 2 separate online interfaces for wildfire and for green space separately that incorporate the results that we've already presented here. And these tools are internal for CARB and were developed on the Google Earth Engine platform, which is a cloud-based platform for academic research where we can host and analyze large data sets for free. And the flexibility of the tool is that if new land management scenarios are developed, they can be then integrated into the tool. And I'll briefly walk through some screenshots of the green space tool, and then I'll pass it to Dr. Marlier for the wildfire piece. Next slide, please. So this screenshot shows how the green space scenario tool works. So essentially you select the health outcome that you're interested in, such as low birth weight, life expectancy, or mortality, as well as the scenario for analysis. And then when you click run, the results will populate on the map, which we will see on the next slide. If you could move the slide over, thank you. And so this image is the results for the mortality outcomes with the universal increase in NDVI on the left and that increase to the urban areas mean on the right. And you can see the results here are just for urban areas across the state. And with a universal increase in every zip code, you see a lot of variation in the health impacts, which is a function of differing population sizes across the zip codes. And on the right, it's hard to see at this statewide level, but we're only estimating impacts in those census tracts that have a baseline greenness below the mean. And we have similar mapped results available on the tool for both life expectancy and birth weight as well. And with that, you can move to the next slide, and I will pass it to Dr. Marlier to discuss the wildfire portion of the tool.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. Connolly, as she mentioned, we split the tool interface into two different components. So she just presented on the green space tool, and now I will present on the wildfire health scenarios tool. So this is a very similar setup to what you just saw for green space, but we're looking at different exposures and outcomes. So what you're seeing here is the interface for the wildfire tool. And what we have here are two complementary ways to model wildfire PM exposures and health outcomes. And so we've presented on this. Dr. Jarrett described this at the beginning, thinking about the trade-offs between using a chemical transport model like CMAC versus a receptor-oriented model like STILT. We have both modeling approaches in the tool, and that's because they can provide complementary results. So what you'll see here in step one is you select the type of model to look at various scenarios. The first one are the annual impact analyses. So that's what Dr. Jarrett presented on earlier. That's the zip code level health and economic analyses from the CMAC chemical transport model. And you can look at these results across the state and for all years from 2008 to 2018. And then the second one is based on the STILT modeling. And so this is where we can incorporate hypothetical management scenarios. And we did this for an example year in 2018. And as Dr. Jarrett mentioned, we use here the computational flexibility of a receptor-oriented model like STILT in order to understand the potential influence of reductions in wildfire emissions on downwind particulate matter concentrations and health. So next slide, please. So this is showing if you were to select that first modeling component that again is looking at the annual impacts across the state based on our CMAC chemical transport model analyses. This is showing what you would be able to see. So on the left-hand side, the map is showing concentrations as well as the outline of fires shown in the red borders. And then at the bottom, it pops up by zip code, the estimated mortality across each year. And then this is correlated to various health and economic impact estimates that are available for each zip code. And you can see that on the right-hand side. And this data, it's both for visualization purposes, but then it can also be downloaded in various forms. Next slide, please. And then the second component of the wildfire tool is thinking about hypothetical future land management scenarios. So this, again, is thinking about how if we were to reduce wildfire emissions by a certain amount, what would the potential benefits be for public health because of reductions in particulate matter concentrations? So this is showing the interface, some screenshots of the interface for this component of the tool, again, based on the STILT modeling results. So first, a user would select the hypothetical management scenarios. We modeled one receptor for each county across the state. So then you would select a county of interest, various health outcomes. And then we have preset different management scenarios. And I have here an example where if there were a 10% reduction in wildfire emissions in the Sierra Nevada ecoregion, what the potential changes would then be for fine particulate matter concentrations from wildfires, and then thinking about different health benefits. Next slide, please. So to wrap up on the tool overall, so again, what we've separated it into two components, more for ease of use, but the tool can be used to quantify and to visualize the public health benefits of green space and wildfire management. And what we can do as well is understand the relative magnitudes associated with different policy interventions. And as I was just showing on the last slide, we've intentionally built this tool to be flexible and to incorporate additional scenarios as they were to be developed and become available. And finally, something that is powerful about this tool, and again, we're leveraging the fact that you can visualize where these benefits occur across the state. So we're not just looking at the total statewide benefits, but also visualizing within certain communities where these benefits could accrue. And I think I will pass this off to Dr. Jarrett again.
Thank you, Drs. Marlier. So this is a very quick summary of some of the work we did on prescribed burning versus wildfires. And here we use the STILT model that we previously described to estimate these county level impacts from wildfire smoke and for prescribed burning. The first thing to note here is that the levels of additional smoke PM 2.5 that result from prescribed burning are really trivial compared to what we see for wildfire smoke. So wildfire smoke, we're going up to 6 micrograms per meter cubed in some counties. The highest contribution we have for prescribed burning is in Fresno County, and that's 0.2 of a microgram. So relatively smaller impacts in terms of the influence on concentrations. We do see, however, that there are some areas, in this case, Fresno, where they had both prescribed burning and wildfire activity in 2018, where there are some measurable impacts that you could see from the prescribed burning. So still much smaller than what we observe from the wildfire smoke, but not inconsequential. And when we look at the total number of deaths that resulted from prescribed burning, we estimate that it's about 25 excess deaths, which is much less than the 1,685 deaths from wildfires. You'll see these numbers are somewhat smaller than what we presented for the CMAQ model. And that's because the STILT model only incorporates the primary particulate matter. So the concentration contributions are much lower. I think one of the key things that came out of our search, and we really hit the literature hard, we talked to a lot of experts in forestry and ecosystem management, that there's really no good estimate right now to look at, the trade-off between prescribed burns and wildfire, large mega wildfires. So in other words, if I increase prescribed burning by, 1,000 acres, what does that mean in terms of reducing the mega wildfire risk? So that makes the scenario computation much more challenging. But even if we look at something like prescribed burning, a 2% reduction in mega wildfires would result in 84 deaths avoided versus the 25 excess deaths. So the benefits could be, even for small changes in wildfire risks, up to say 3 times greater than the deaths attributable to prescribed burning. And we've been working on these estimates to go out to 2045, and I'll talk about that in a minute, with CARB staff and scenarios that were developed to support their scoping plan. I just note here too, as well, this raises some thorny ethical issues, because the people that are experiencing the prescribed burning smoke may not be the ones that benefit from reductions in wildfire smoke. So there's a trade-off and a sort of equity issue that emerges that we still are grappling with ourselves. So this was a project that was added on to the original contract at the request of ARB staff, so that they could look at the potential health implications of achieving carbon neutrality through their scoping plan. And Dr. Adam Moreno was very helpful in supplying us his estimates. But essentially, we followed this process where we had geospatial pre-processing. We developed scaling factors that could translate global biomass consumed into localized areas. We then applied that to the fin emission grid cells, and then Dr. Lee simulated a baseline level of emissions with geoschem, and then she did that going out to 2035 and 2045. So we have scenarios. One is known as the action scenario. And this involves really ramping up the treatment of forests by a factor of 10. So there's about 200,000 acres that are treated now. This, I think, was a realistic scenario that lines up with federal and state goals to increase the treatment of the forest to something on the order of 2.5 million acres. So that is a dramatic increase. And what we were trying to do is quantify what the health implications of that were. We used 3 global climate models that are typically employed in assessments in California, the so-called CAN ESM, which is sort of considered to be an average prediction of future climates, the HADGEM, which is predicting hotter, drier conditions, and MIROC, which is known as complementary, meaning it has some elements of both of those too. So when we look at the file processing, this looks fairly much like a textbook example of geoprocessing for something that I might teach my GIS students in graduate school, but it turned out to be a very complex undertaking because we had a lot of misaligned units. So we had eco units. Dr. Moreno did complex, Monte Carlo simulation ecosystem modeling for representative watersheds in each of the 7 eco units across California. And we had an ownership file which characterized certain management patterns. We had land use files, and then we had to resample that so that we could bring in the fin data, and then finally get a merged layer that allows us to give a spatially explicit representation of potential emissions from different management scenarios going into the future. And these are combined with future climate scenarios as well. Now, one of the things that I think was surprising to us, initially at least, is that there was a lot of variability year to year in these different management scenarios. So you can see here, the business as usual is the dark red line, and the dotted red line is the so-called action scenario, or scenario 3. And year to year, these tend to vary a lot. And you can see that the years that we picked for some of the future climate predictions are relatively high years. So started in 2025, 2035, 2045, but that varies between scenarios. So this hot, dry climate model shows that the years we picked are relatively low compared to what would be the time series average. And with the complementary model, we get something that's in between, but quite high by the 2045 model. So this, I think the point of this is that the future climates and the way that they're modeled has a dramatic impact on the potential for carbon consumed by fire. And that behooves us, I think, to do everything we can to try to mitigate climate change by reducing carbon emissions, because we want to try to reduce the impact and that variability, which once it's rolling can't really be controlled. So this just shows the concentration differences that we see if we look at different scenarios and different. So this is business as usual with the CAN ESM, and for emissions, you can't really see anything dramatic there. But when you look at the difference between the two, you can see that there are some areas that are going to increase, denoted in red, and there are other areas that are going to experience decreases. And that's particularly relevant up here in the Klamath Forest, Siskiyou County areas where there's a lot of fire activity and a lot of biomass. So this just shows the average concentrations under each of the scenarios for 2025, 2035, and 2045. And again, you can see that in some of these instances, partly based on those emissions that we saw earlier, or the biomass consumed, we get fairly large increases if we continue with business as usual and somewhat improved. But it's worth noting as well that in some instances, depending on the climate model, the business as usual could actually be lower for some of the years than what we see for the action scenario. This just shows the difference as we go from the baseline to different years. And you can see again, we're getting a mixed pattern. So some areas are going to be reduced, some are increasing. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Garcia Gonzalez to talk about some of our health impact assessments.
Thank you, Dr. Jarrett. So for this current slide, and similar to the estimates using historic CMAT concentrations, we used a short-term dose response coefficient for mortality, adjusted for long-term impacts per the methods detailed by Dr. Jarrett earlier in this presentation, and in the recently published manuscript by Connolly et al., published this year or last month. We utilized BenMap preloaded county level long-term population projections to calculate future populations for our targeted timeframe. Future incidence rates were downloaded, and the total number of deaths per county were calculated from the future population estimates for the appropriate years. And then we use the GeoSchem PM2.5 concentrations to ultimately estimate our health impacts. We did that outside of BenMaps at the county level. So here we present the estimated annual total mortality burden for exposure to wildfire PM2.5 throughout California. We aggregated it, all the counties, estimated for the 3 global climate models, or GCMs, as Dr. Jarrett was discussing, for the CAN ESM, the HADGM, and the MERAC, and the 2 future land management scenarios. Business as usual and the action scenario.
I just wanted to jump in and say that somebody has been continuously interrupting the meeting, so we'd really like you to try to mute yourself. Yes, you just did it again. So can you please mute yourself?
For 2025, 2035, and 2045 is shown here. The action scenario performs slightly better under the average GCMs, and we can see, for example, that in 2035, which is between the 2 dashed lines, excuse me, that under CAN ESM, we estimate around 1,000 excess deaths for the business as usual scenario in blue, versus the action scenario in orange, underscoring the benefits of implementing aggressive land management strategies in certain years under specific climate conditions. Next slide, please. And here we depict county level mortality impacts across California, specifically for 2035. So looking a little bit deeper into what we were just discussing to visualize the spatial changes over time under the action scenario specifically. We see in general that the highest impacts are in Los Angeles, Orange, Fresno, Monterey, and San Diego counties, likely due to its large population and proximity to wildfire carbon stocks. LA County is predicted to experience the highest number of excess deaths in this example. Despite the larger wildfire-specific concentrations predicted in some of the northern and Sierra regions, as seen on the previous slides, that the excess mortality in counties like Alpine, Sierra, Mono, and Inyo are relatively low. While wildfires are commonly in more rural and forested regions, the impacts can be, as we all know, more widespread throughout population centers such as Los Angeles, as smoke can be transported into these urban centers. Between the three GCMs, over all 3 years, the CANESM resulted in the most favorable outcomes, where we estimate approximately 20 billion in economic benefits for adopting the action scenario versus business as usual. Under the other GCMs, there is an estimated up to 1 billion in added economic cost for the same scenarios compared to business as usual. This nuance highlights the important role that climate plays on future management actions. While we expect, even under the best management scenarios, to see variabilities between years, that the climate ultimately plays a key role and a very crucial role in the potential wildfire impacts. Next slide, please. So we also assessed the morbidity impacts. This time we actually did that within BenMaps directly to develop our estimates, where we find similar variabilities in the outputs, once again underscoring the role climate has on these estimates. Here we present statewide health outcome estimates for respiratory-related hospitalizations and emergency room visits using wildfire-specific PM 2.5 coefficients for the 3 GCMs and over the 3 different years in the action scenario specifically. So briefly, there are some key limitations that that are important to note here. First, that we use historic incidence rates to project future health outcomes for the morbidity estimates, which does not account for changes in demographics, healthcare, and public health behaviors, which could significantly alter future wildfire exposures and disease rates. Further, we use the GeoSchem model for scenario-based projections, which, despite being computationally efficient, may not have captured local air quality variations or short-term pollution events accurately. Further, our analysis was based on the 3 years of action scenarios over a 20-year time frame. These selected years, as Dr. Jared pointed out, may not totally represent this series accurately, potentially missing full benefits from climate action scenarios. Despite these limitations, we believe that these methods and results shared here provide a critical step in better understanding the impacts and interactions of future wildfire exposures, management scenarios, and health impacts. Next slide, please. And now to synthesize and conclude, I will hand it back to Dr. Jarrett.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia-Gonzalez. So yes, I think, what we're showing here is that there are considerable health and mortality impacts associated with the management of natural and working lands, and particularly with wildfires that we're estimating in tens of thousands of deaths and hundreds of billions of dollars of impacts. So there's a lot of scope there for improving the management and still having a net social benefit. Because the current investments that we see being made in wildland fire management are probably far less than the damages that are accruing. We can see also that some interventions like greening can have really strong health benefits. And they also help to mitigate climate. And with urban greening, it's not as much just the absorption or sequestration of carbon in the plants, which is relatively small compared to large, national forests, but it's also the impact of the greening on heat and subsequent energy consumption that can lead to reduced carbon emissions through reduced energy demand. And this shows that we can, achieve both climate mitigation and adaptation to reduce other health impacts like those from heat through, which we did not directly quantify through the addition of more green space in urban areas, particularly in disadvantaged communities that don't have a very high baseline. And when we look at the future scenarios, these are much more challenging to interpret because there's high variability between the climate models, and we don't really know what the truth is or what will play out. These are all commonly used in the climate community, but as you could see, in some instances, there could be actually negative health implications from increased management actions, and we feel that this is really an area that deserves a lot more attention. And then some of those issues that Dr. Garcia Gonzalez just mentioned about looking at changes in population dynamics and an aging population and what that might mean for additional impacts are critically important. So some of our recommendations and things that we think would improve the scenario tool going forward, we'd certainly like to elicit feedback from key decision makers on the scenario tool via workshops, focus groups, and other similar formats. We weren't really funded to do that as part of this project, but we feel that going forward, that would be a good way to ensure that the tools are going to be as useful as possible for the intended users. And in this case, that's everyone from government agencies at various levels, community-based organizations, and individuals who just might be interested. Understanding the trade-offs between different management scenarios and emissions, particularly for prescribed burning and mega wildfires, is going to be important going into the future. And as I mentioned, currently there's no easy algorithm that we can apply that says for every 10 or 1,000 acres of prescribed burning, I'm going to reduce, 100,000 acres of mega wildfires. That's not in the literature. We searched extensively and consulted with numerous experts. And then there's the ethical trade-off that I mentioned, looking at where the smoke is impacting people in nearby communities, and that the ones that benefit from the prevention of mega wildfires may not be the same people that are being impacted by prescribed burning. So this is an area that requires further investigation. We really think that there's a lot of scope here to understand the equity impacts by analyzing specific cost and benefit distributions at high spatial resolution across the state. And we've shown in the paper that Dr. Conley showed or presented on urban green space that a lot of the benefits accrue to disadvantaged communities. And that's important because we see persistent health inequalities in California and in the United States and many other places in the world. And if we want to reduce those, we have to know what the distributional impacts are, the cost and benefits of better management. And then we're leveraging urban green space to address various other mechanisms. So how does reducing heat have population health benefits? The coefficients that we used in our studies were largely devoid of mechanistic investigations about why people were being made more healthy by green space. There are many possibilities ranging from physical activity increases, declines in obesity, mental health impacts, increases in social capital, and then reductions in exposure from heat, air pollution, and other adverse exposures that may accrue, like stormwater flooding. So there's a large scope to better understanding that and in mitigating the wildfire risks. So we need to think about the mechanisms of threats and what that's going to do. And for people that are interested, on July 29th, we'll have a paper that's coming out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that deals with climate change and public health in California. It will be embargoed until then, But look for some press releases on that, and it will be publicly available after July 29th. So again, I want to thank all my collaborators and all of the people I've named at the Air Resources Board. And I want to thank you for taking this time on a Friday afternoon in the middle of summer to join us for our webinar today. We'd be happy to entertain any comments you have at this point or questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jarrett and your team for that great presentation. So now we will go over the questions. So you can raise your hands virtually and I'll call on you in the order it is received. So Georgia, you can unmute yourself.
Oh, hello. Thank you for this really important work. I really appreciate it. I'm a resident of the Santa Monica Mountains and of course am very interested in these concerns and problems. Goodness.
Emmanuel Diaz, I think that you need to mute yourself because we're hearing you on an ongoing basis through the webinar. Would you be able to make sure that your mute is on? Yeah, we're.
Just to note that we have asked Mr. Diaz to mute himself, and we are happy to take comments.
Okay.
But please go ahead and we will keep muting speakers if it's not their turn, and when it is their turn, we'll make sure they have the opportunity to speak. Thanks.
Thank you. So this is just putting a few things together rather quickly and not necessarily in the organization that I would have previously if I had time to put it together. But one of the things that you didn't mention was was ignition points. And those, as I'm sure you know, are the most critical factor, especially in Southern California. And the cause of wildfires is really, utility lines. So therefore, burying the utility lines, which does not really have to be the extensive cost that has been claimed, can be a good source of just eliminating that problem. The other issues that you get when you disrupt the habitat, of course, are the incursion of, besides destroying habitat, are incursion of invasives and type conversion. And basically that, for the chaparral here, that is extremely unhealthy. I'm sure you already know that the frequency of burns here is approximately every 30 to 150 years, and that's what it takes for the habitat to restore itself. In other words, not a frequent burning. The other point would be whether the prescribed burns that you're mentioning actually reduce a wildfire. And I would suggest at least in the chaparral, I'm not speaking for, mixed conifer or alpine forests, but they really are contraindicated because any disruption is really destructive to the habitat. Of course, that would affect biodiversity. So there's many fallouts. And in addition to that, once you destroy the habitat, there will be more desiccation of plants surrounding habitat, as well as, more heat because, the sun is just basically beating on bare earth. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if any team members want to comment or. Yeah, definitely there are many other complex trade-offs in terms of ecosystem health that we haven't been able to address in this project, but they merit additional attention as well.
I can just add to that briefly. Thank you for your comment. You mentioned the fire emissions points, And I will note that the analysis that Dr. Jarrett and Dr. Connolly were presenting on, that's looking at our CMAC CTM results, that is based on largely satellite-based observations of fire emissions. So those ignition points would be going into the satellite observations, and then that's used as a source that is then run into the models. But it's a really important point about future, thinking about future emissions and where wildfires or prescribed fires would be located. So thank you for your comment.
Do we have other questions?
No raised hands. Okay, Bonnie?
Hi there. Thank you so much. Appreciate the work. Looking forward to the article. Congrats on your LA Times piece. It was very, very important work. I just wondered if you could talk a little more about, I guess, a couple areas. One is prescribed burning versus wildfire. And, you know, we appreciate that you were able to make these estimates, which show a benefit. Granted, as you said, there's some ethical considerations to think about in terms of where these benefits are being experienced. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts on if there's other work that needs to be done or other ways to better understand the benefits of prescribed burn and the kinds of trade-offs that you are talking about. I guess that's one question. And another question is just if there's anything more to say about the future scenarios and the inconsistent findings in terms of the action scenario, and whether, when you mentioned the modeling variability as being a big reason for some of the variation in the results and some of the negative results. I wonder if there's any more comments about that.
Yeah, I can take a first response, and then perhaps others want to chime in. But when we look at the prescribed burning, and I went through a lot of material quickly, so maybe I didn't make this as clear as I could have. But what we really need for these types of scenarios is to say, within a certain ecozone, if I increase prescribed burning by a certain amount of acres, then I might expect for every prescribed burning acre to see reductions in mega wildfires by 3 or 4 acres. And there is a review paper by Fowler et al. That goes through it very carefully. I think, a lot of the detailed literature from the forestry and ecology fields on that topic. And there are estimates like that. But they essentially say in the article, but you should not pool these estimates because, out of the 10 we reviewed, 4 are showing positive, 3 are showing negative, and some show no effect. So getting a better understanding of that is, I think, going to be very important. And then trying to understand whether or not the composition of the smoke that is coming off of prescribed burns is different than what you get from mega wildfires. And whether that influences the toxicity is another area that is, relatively uninvestigated. I think overall, it's fair to say that the toxicology of wildfire smoke has not been thoroughly investigated. And I have colleagues here at UCLA that are medical toxicologists, like Dr. Jesus Araujo, that serve on, grant review panels. And, he's basically come to that conclusion in our extensive discussions that it's really an understudied area. So that's another aspect. And then I think that there's always the risk of the prescribed burning has happened in New Mexico. Unfortunately, I think probably 3 years ago, where prescribed burn sparked the state's biggest wildfire. So what are the management tools that can be put in place to avoid that type of runaway accidental ignition? that could lead to huge amounts of smoke that were unattended. And I think the other thing too is with the prescribed burning, how do we better message to people that are potentially impacted? What are some of the measures that they can take if they are going to experience wildfire smoke? Do they have HEPA filters they can use indoors? Can they close their windows if it's 104 degrees? And do they have air conditioning? So trying to understand the populations that are likely to be affected by the prescribed burning and how they can better adapt to the smoke impacts that they might experience. But yeah, I think one of the good things that we showed here is that the magnitude of the impacts is really small compared to what we see from wildfires. So we don't have that magic number for the trade-off about increasing prescribed burning, but it's certainly very small. And part of the reason for that is that there has not been a lot of prescribed burning done, so that it's really very small compared to what's projected to be needed. And then there are a lot of sort of micro scale forestry issues. And I don't know if Dr. Charney is in the audience. He's an expert in this area and he helped us quite a bit. But the positioning of the prescribed burning can have a dramatic impact on how it stops fires, and you can see some of that, say some of the prescribed burning during the large fires that were occurring in Lake Tahoe area. Some of that would have been much more catastrophic had you not had the prescribed burning. So what are the optimal places to burn if you're trying to avoid these large fires from getting out of control? I'll just say this from a personal perspective, whose son is up fighting the Shelley wildfire right now, in 104-degree heat. Really understudied, the impacts of the smoke on the occupational settings, and the prescribed burns that by definition they have to be right into the ignition source when they start those fires. So are there different risks for people that are involved in wildland fire management than there would be if they were fighting a wildfire, and trying to understand what those are and how to minimize them?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, it sounds like you still think that there are areas where there's more research needed, particularly with the toxicity.
As an academic, I always think
as an academic, you're always going to say that, but you have highlighted in terms of the toxicity, that toxicity and the
and then going back to the annual variability, that was something that surprised us, and we really interrogated the data, and we talked to Dr. Moreno. I don't know if he's in the audience now, but trying to better understand, well, what does this really mean? Because if you look at some of those results, even the best management scenarios are potentially going to, depending on the future climate, lead to increases in some of the morbidity and mortality impacts in certain areas. So I think there's a lot more to be done there about downscaling these models, trying to understand what's going to cause the variability. And then if there are management scenarios that can better match those more extreme future conditions, what are they and how can we begin implementing them? I know Dr. Marlier is an expert at, looking at, and Dr. Lee, these types of models. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I definitely echo on what you just said. I think there are definitely a lot of research need to be done. And I also want to say California has been doing a wonderful job, especially the UCLA team has leading a wonderful job doing research regarding prescribed burning for other states. So even emissions from prescribed burning need to be better identified and also quantified. And I think that's also limit the following research regarding how prescribed burning can influence air quality. Another thing is, I think we may also trying to combine like prescribed burning and also the meteorological condition. And that may be another way that we can do the prescribed burning under ideal meteorological conditions to reduce the downwind influences. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I guess one other thing that's happening is that the so-called safe season for prescribed burning has been getting smaller. So we're seeing extensive fire activity very early in the season this year in June, which would have typically been a period where you might consider prescribed burning because the risk of having a large wildfire was less. But as we get into the changing climate and these droughted conditions and the variability in high precipitation with fuel buildup and followed by dry years, the windows to conduct prescribed burning are shrinking. And that's got implications. I know this is just anecdotal. It's because I'm the father of a wildland firefighter. I mean, one of the challenges that the firefighters face is that, if they're trying to ignite these fires, if they do it too early in the season, they won't be able to get the fire going, so there's that issue. So they have to get it into a point where there is some combustible fuel that's not totally wet. But the windows are getting smaller, it seems, as the fire season extends. I see we have Lara.
Yeah, Lala, can you?
Yeah,
Sorry.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for very, very useful presentation. I want to introduce myself. I am actually receiving about 10, 15 emails every day from different energy sectors and of course from CARB. Many national labs also interested. I am presenting first time new technology. It is light materials, light energy materials, which produce electricity under the pressure. So embedded into the tires, and we know that any fire, wildfire, can start from fires, burning fires, and it is very important for any kind of transportation. So I can introduce now in very simple words, very short, but maybe later if it will be interest, because I submitted my proposal for 5 fiscal year for research in the CARB, and soon it will be with me a collaboration, and I want really to talk about that, to start talking. So these light materials, named piezo from Greek word pressure. Under the pressure, vibration, motion, produce clean electricity without most of flammable heavy packs of batteries. So combination with much less amount of batteries, of course, would be very useful, and we can start that project. Because again, fire can very easy start from tires, and UN now, I was in their meeting, they proposing to change the materials of tires. So avoid about at least these industrial sources of fires. We have considering new technology as well. So, Dr. Gillett, maybe I can contact with you later. I know your email address, and if it will be interest, we can discuss it.
That sounds great. Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Barbara?
Hi there. Thank you for the discussion on the prescribed fires, as well as the firefighter effects, which, I know you have a huge interest in, and we all do, with the occupational effects and, the lack of studies that have been done, although there was a long-term study that I think is still ongoing to look at some firefighter effects, and found some effects consistent with firefighters. But one of the things that I just wanted to kind of bring to everyone's attention and just kind of put that out there for people to think about with the prescribed fires versus the wildfires, and that is the toxicity that you get from structural burns and vehicle burns,
Yeah.
which is something that, you know, you won't get with a prescribed fire. And so just want to kind of bring that into the mix, that we know that there's a huge amount of toxins that are involved in vehicle fires and in structural fires, and of course that is, you know, one of the components of wildfire that will definitely, hopefully always, be absent from prescribed fire unless you get a prescribed fire that goes out of control. So I wanted to kind of bring that and see if there was any comments on that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's definitely a valid comment. I haven't seen any good studies yet about, you know, if you look at the volume of smoke, certainly localized areas where there are structures and vehicles on fire, you are going to get those accentuations of toxicity. However, I don't know in terms of the volume of smoke that comes off major wildfire, how much that actually contributes, you know, so that's, and I'm not sure if anybody else on the team, like Miriam or Yang, has seen anything on that. But my sense is that the volume of material is much less than what you would get out of a very large wildfire, in terms of the smoke emissions. But you know, it's an area that definitely could require more study to try and understand that. I've seen, you know, there are certainly studies going on trying to simulate what happens when certain types of building material get burned and what sort of emissions they put off, but it's not entirely clear yet, I don't think.
Yeah, I would agree with that, just to chime in. I agree that it's a huge research need to try to understand the different the composition of particles and other air pollutants that could be coming off from structure or vehicle fires versus vegetation burning. Another challenge as well will be scaling up some of those estimates as well. And so that's something that I think is a definite additional need for future research.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for different resources, I mean, I have a colleague here at Baylor, and she researched on the firefighter exposure to different type of fires, and they can also get the samples from their clothes, and then after the fire, and then they can analyze the composition. So that's definitely a lot of research need to be done. And also regarding wildfire, so because different vegetation, they can have different emission factors. That means the fire maybe occur in California or occur in Texas, they're gonna have different vegetation type. They also have different emission factor and generate different chemical compositions. So definitely a lot of research need to be done. And another thing is under climate change, and there's also a changing pattern of the vegetation. So some of the cold area, I mean, they become warm and then they may grow other type of vegetation, or some of the warm area, I mean, they become warmer and then the vegetation have to migrate to the northern part. So that's also the changing of vegetation pattern. And there's also a need to maybe use the dynamic vegetation fire model and then to kind of like from the big wheel to see the interactions between the two, and also to see how these influence fire, influence air quality. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Lee's also getting at another important issue, and that is the idea of compounding effects. So what does it mean when you have very extreme precipitation events following wildfire burning, where you've got huge burn scars? And what are the health implications there for drinking water and for other resources and for ecosystems? So that's an area that you know, is really sort of at the forefront of climate research and hasn't really been well addressed, I don't think, yet. We will be addressing that as part of some of our ongoing studies, but largely through literature review.
Wonderful, thank you.
And there are no raised hands. Maybe we can now go over the chat questions. The first one, these tools look awesome. Are they available online? If not, when do you anticipate making them available? They are public facing tool, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still discussing that with our colleagues at the ARB to see when they feel it would be useful to put it online. As I said, we would like to do workshops and try to get more structured feedback on these sites. And at UCLA, we have a series of different sites that we're working on. And one of the things we're discussing is how can we integrate those so that you could really have more of a one-stop shop so that you could look at heat impacts, wildfire impacts. That would be a longer term project. But certainly I think there's enough there now that it could go online and we could have forums for soliciting feedback. However, we haven't really discussed that fully with our colleagues at ARB funded this, so we want to respect their wishes.
Thank you. Next question is more of a comment. Could incentives moving people out during prescribed burns, which is better than the alternative and could be baked into the model regulation? Then essentially makes exposure to smoke from prescribed burn voluntary, which mitigates the ethical and health dilemma.
Yeah, I think voluntary, by individual is something that you might be able to do, but trying to, get consensus within a community that might be affected would be a real challenge, right? So there are many different perspectives on prescribed burning. I think the main thing is to try to look at, how to minimize those impacts, how to do it when the meteorological conditions are right, and how to protect people in the event that they are getting smoke incursions into their neighborhoods and potentially their homes. There's also another, I think, understudied area that we've been interested in because we work at UCLA. We have an occupational environmental health center, and we work with some industrial hygienists who deal a lot with post-fire remediation. And what you can see from doing very detailed electron microscopy and chemical analysis is houses. This is probably more the case for really heavy wildfire smoke intrusion, but it could, in some instances, apply to prescribed burning. You need to have a proper protocol for going in and testing whether there's residual particulate in the home and what the best mechanisms are for removing that. Because even if the house is well sealed with a HEPA filter, you are going to get some penetration of the particles. So that's an area that's pretty wide open and hasn't really been investigated. We've tried, but not through ARB, but through some other funding agencies to get that funded. And I guess it's one of those topics that doesn't scream out as particularly stimulating, but it might be very important moving forward as we want to minimize the impacts. And I remember doing some work with the industrial hygienist for another study where we're looking at indoor air, and they were basically saying, well, we can see that there's been a fire in this area, and the fire was 8 years before we'd done our sampling. So some of the charred pollens and pieces of wood were still in the house, and they have the capacity to off gas for several months after they've intruded. So there is a literature on that for municipal fires and wildfires, but this often becomes an environmental justice issue too, because someone who has smoke intrusion in the hills of Bel Air may be able to have a professional industrial hygiene team come in, and they may have good insurance. If they're living in a low income rental area at the fringe of Ventura, they may end up not getting any remediation at all. So those are some issues that I think are still brewing and, you know, could be looked at in more detail.
Thank you. Next, has this outcome map for all-cause mortality been created for per capita rather than total incident?
So as a rate of, so I think, but Miriam, you're more familiar with the website. We definitely have the total count. I don't know if we've converted it into a rate, say per 10,000. But that would be a good thing to incorporate.
Could we possibly clarify, is this with reference to the tool or the add-on or both? Currently in the tool, we don't have it per capita, but that's a good suggestion and something that we can consider adding in. And then if it's for the add-on project that Dr. Jarrett presented on and the final part of our presentation, Diane, can you possibly comment on that?
For the wildfire tool, the mortality and the economic impact is included, but not per capita.
So for the add-on as well, for the future simulations.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a really good recommendation and
Yeah.
something that we could implement fairly quickly. We have done it. We have a heat mapping website. So we do the rates and the counts in that website. So you can look at, you know, what's the rate of excess hospital or emergency room visits on excess heat days, or you can look at the count. And the rate is important because that will show you the areas that are being impacted more regardless of their population size. Whereas the counts are important to people that are, say, healthcare planners who want to know how many patients are going to come into their emergency rooms on, you know, after wildfire events. So, but yeah, it's a great accommodation, but we don't have that incorporated in the tool yet, or great suggestions, right? So.
Okay, thank you. There's another comment. I look forward to assessment of effects of both undergrounding wears and habitat disruption, heat and habitat disruption, heat gain, desiccation of surrounding habits, loss of biodiversity, and permanent type of conservation resulting in exacerbation of these effects. And additional benefit of undergrounding is reserving the loss of trees and other vegetation that will eliminate the extensive cost of cutting the vegetation, increasing, okay. Additional significant the message is okay. Undergrounding wears and house hardening are two factors which has been identified as eliminating or mitigating effects of wildfire. So this is more of a comment.
Yeah, I think, you know, the undergrounding is one approach, but it is going to be extremely costly, and you are going to have a lot of ecological disruption as you dig up the trenches to put wires underground. There's a related issue, and that is, you know, the deferred maintenance of forests that are close to existing transmission lines, and what that really, what needs to be done there to ensure that we don't have more sort of Santa Rosa-like firestorms that result in direct fatalities and huge smoke impacts. So that's a really good suggestion, and one that we didn't have the capacity in this contract to look at, but definitely an area to look at in the future. And then the ecological impacts, I totally agree that those are critical and they should be built into the scenarios. In this study, we were focused on the human health impacts, which are, were unexplored when we started. So, but that's an area that definitely requires more research. And I think going forward, as we hopefully have more rapid energy transitions toward solar and wind, there are issues there that are related to, whether we want to have big solar farms that are run by utilities, or whether we want to rely more on distributed networks of community solar, which would, in many instances, avoid the big power lines that have been responsible for several major wildfire ignitions. So that's a bigger, broader area of discussion, but certainly one that merits some integrated analysis.
There's no more questions in the chat. If anybody from the audience wants to ask any question, you can raise your hands.
I see Bonnie has her.
Just a quick question. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that you didn't, you weren't able to include the heat benefits going on back on the greenness. You weren't able to include the heat benefits, and could you just remind us? I mean, I know there was a lot. This was a huge project, and there was a lot of work on health benefits on both sides. But I think, heat benefits and air pollution benefits, I think, were not included as part of the greenness. And can you just kind of explain why you had to make those decisions, I guess? Or
yeah. Well, I mean, we had to come up with a sort of dose response function that could quantify those impacts, which we thought would have the most salience for policymaking. And because there's a fairly large literature that was summarized by David Ruda-Rojas, in his 2019 paper in Lancet Planetary Health about the mortality reductions, there are so many angles on why green space, is beneficial for health. We are preparing, and we had prepared as part of the review paper I showed you, a section that sort of really delved into the conceptual model about how green space, all the different pathways from climate change to green space, either through, mitigating energy use, through reduced heat. So it would have required an additional study where we could quantify, okay, well, we're going to add in this much green space or tree canopy, and it's going to reduce the heat by that much on extreme days, and that's going to then reduce the impacts. We felt that it's an important area, and I think right now there have really only been a small handful of studies. One was done by my colleagues over at IS Global in Barcelona, led by Mark Neuenhausen, where they made assumptions about differences between urban heat islands and, surrounding areas, and then attributed that to urban heat, and then looked at what green space would do, and did a good job estimating those types of impacts. But the literature is still quite sparse on that kind of integrated approach. But certainly going forward, that's something that is, people are really digging into this. And, we did some studies on early childhood development up in Canada where they have great data on that. And, you can see that a lot of the benefits of green space on early childhood development are coming through reductions in air pollution. There are only 2 studies that look at that kind of mediational analysis at this point. So when we looked in the literature, I don't think, especially when we started 4 years ago, it wasn't there. So
for both the air pollution and for the heat, it's just the literature base wasn't there. Thank you, Dr. Jarrett.
Based on my read of the literature, you can have localized effects from vegetation that may have substantial benefits. And you could also have, the NOAC studies from the Forest Service, big, countywide reductions that are very small, that I think his health impact assessment showed something like 8,000 avoided deaths by increasing, tree canopy and reducing the associated pollution. But the pollution impacts are very site specific, and they're probably not that big. The heat impacts, on the other hand, are pretty well documented, that you can reduce heat by introducing green space and trees in urban areas. And we do have pretty good dose response functions for what heat does. So that could be done, I think, but we could certainly try to do it. We did look into it, but we just felt like the literature wasn't there. We would have been making too many really tenuous assumptions.
Thank you, Dr. Jarrett, for explaining that. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Jarrett. I don't see any questions on the chat. Any last minute questions from the audience?
Much work still to be done from Georgia.
Yeah.
Yes, totally agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe we can end early if we don't have any additional comments or questions from the audience. Yeah, thank you all for your participation, and thank you, Dr. Jarrett and your team, for doing the presentation and also handling all the questions. So everybody have a good weekend. I will adjourn the meeting now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your work.
Much.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.